definition of a constitution. A constitution must have purpose, and the purpose must be to create a nation that conduces to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificator running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We've got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Dr. Beitar Ramrak has completed his BA in Political Science at CUNY City College and received both his MA and PhD degrees from New York University. He currently has an upcoming book of Mr. Jung Bahadur Singh. Jung Bahadur Singh was a prominent leader in Guyana and the Caribbean. He was a trusted self-appointed mediator who assisted sugar workers in their disputes with management. He was one of the few early Indian medical doctors in Guyana, and as a ship doctor, he has made numerous trips accompanying Indian immigrants who are leaving India to be taken to the colonies, as well as Indians who are returning to India. He has made contributions towards nation building in Guyana, and it has been unmatched by many of his peers.
Good evening to all Guyanese out there in Guyana or wherever you might be. Welcome to another edition of GlobeSpan 24/7. This program is brought to you live on two platforms, namely YouTube and Facebook. So we are live. And tonight we will talk about the race issue in Guyana, but more importantly, we would like to focus on some solutions. We all discuss the race issues, we talk about it all the time, but the question is, how do we address that issue? And how do we move forward from here? I would like to remind our audience again that since we are live, you also have an opportunity to participate and interact with our audience. You can send your questions in via email, or you can also make a phone call to the number that you see below our screen. So again, this program is brought to you live by GlobeSpan, by Mr. Nohar Singh, Devin, and the crew that is operating out of New York. We have two very famous or well-known guests on our program today. But before I introduce our guests, I'd like to set our program tonight in some kind of context, because I think this is a discussion that we need to have, not just tonight, but it's a discussion we need to have as we go forward. So before we get to our guests, let me remind our audience that, when we look at Guyana's politics, and I am old enough to remember, even though today it seems like the nation is so divided and there's a lot of intransigence between the opposition and those in government, we have had in Guyana situations where we have had politicians working together, and the Guyanese community and the Guyanese populations, were united. I can point to two of those instances, right? The first one historically goes back to, let's say, the 1950s. From the 1950 to 1955, when we had the PPP was formed. It was a multiracial organization. it was seen as a very legitimate organization, and it was made up of very credible, very prominent citizens of Guyana, or at that time subjects of Britain. It included people like Chetty Jagan, Lachman Singh, Ashton Chase, elder statesman UC Guyana, and so on. So this period of Guyana's history, which reflected some level of unity among our people, at least the PPP government was described as a mass base. The PPP was described as a mass based political organization. So I would say that was actually one instance where people work together and politicians actually work together. The younger generation would be familiar with another period when Guyanese seems to have worked pretty well together as a population. And this period has to do with the late 1970s when Dr. Walter Rodney and the WPA created a multiracial opposition to the then PNC organization. I remember very well, and I'm sure our guests can remember, attending many of those meetings with Dr. Rodney and others, Ruth Ryan and so on, who were part of the WPA. When you look out into the audience and the crowd that came to these meetings, it was a reflection of a very multiracial organization. Now, having said that, we know the situation today in Guyana. If you were to walk around and talk to people, you can actually predict as to how people might vote, primarily, right? Um, Based on their ethnicity or race, which is a sad reality of where we are in Guyana. We would all like to have a very united government that works on behalf of all Guyanese. But that, nirvana of a multiracial society seems a little bit elusive, and it seems like, we are having some difficulty saying that we are actually, one people living in the same nation and sharing a common destiny. But all is not forsaken, because we do have some instances where we know that Guyanese, or at least politicians, have proposed plans, right? Plans to address the racial ethnic problem that we have in Guyana. Again, it's a small population, less than a million. So it's very difficult to see why we can't establish a society where we can all work together. So I want to point to at least three solutions, right, when it comes to addressing the race or ethnic problem in Guyana, that have been promoted in some form. So the first one goes back to, especially the national elections that were held, where the PPP were able to win a majority of the votes. Primarily, and I'm looking at, let's say, after the 1990s, when the election was held, 1992 to, let's say, 2001. The PPP was able to win an election primarily because of its large ethnic base, right? From the PPP's perspective, they felt that they were a national government that represented all Guyanese, because they claim, as you've heard former President Donald Ramatar have said many times before on the show, that the PPP is multiracial and is operating under a class system. However, the PPP has failed to recognize the fact that since the large population of African Guyanese did not support the PPP, we had what we have called, a term that I have coined many years ago, called the ethnic security dilemma, meaning that if the PPP was going to win elections primarily based on their ethnic support, Africans would be excluded from that political base, whoever controls the executive branch and the legislative branch. But again, that was one solution, which is primarily held by the PPP, being that they claim, and still do claim, that they are a multiracial organization. So that's one. The second solution, so-called solution, I would like to point to, goes back to the 1960s, where people like elder statesmen UC Guyana and Nicholson came up with this concept of partition. Again, looking at the situation in Guyana, it was much more complex in terms of what they proposed, but the concept of partition was there. Partition is not even though it's a radical idea. I mean, countries have solved their ethnic problems by partition. I can think of India, Pakistan, the most recent country that was formed, South Sudan, was created out of larger Sudan. So the countries were divided along that line. Czechoslovakia no longer exists because the people there decided to go on their own. So all I'm saying is you have that one instance of majoritarian rule where people feel, or some people feel, that that could be a way forward. And the second one could be this whole question of partition. And I do believe, I'm going out on a limb here, that if we continue to have this ethnic divide, you might have people thinking along that line. There is a group, I believe, in Borbis that is calling for federalism, not partition, but I think they sense the fact that power ought to be taken away from the central government. So those are the two categories. But there's also another one, which I know both of our guests are familiar with, which is the whole notion of um, shared government slash power sharing. And I think both of our guests today have written a lot about this. They've spoken a lot about this. So we will get a chance to participate and ask questions along that line. Um, so tonight we have two guests. My first guest is Dr. David Hines, who is well known on GlobeSpan. He's a member of the WPA. Speaking to him earlier, I know he was campaigning in Guyana, but he's back in Phoenix. So he's here with us. And of course, we have Mr. Ravi Dev, who was the leader of ROAR, um, right, which is a political party that competed in the 2001 election. So again, before I go to our guests, in the interest of full disclosure here, there are two things I'd like to say. One is that um, recently there have been a poll, a national opinion poll that was reported in the Guyana newspaper under the banner of TRPI. Now, some people, folks in your audience might know that TRPI was an organization that I created in 1991 to do opinion polling in Guyana. We did several in 1991 and again in 1992. Those results were published in Starbrick News and in an academic journal called The Wrong Table, right? And it's there for the public to see. Long story short, I am not in any way connected to this recent poll that was done by former associates of TRPI. My second my second statement in terms of full disclosure is both of our guests know that I was also a member of ROAR. So I want to put that out there. Um, but tonight, I am your humble moderator. Um, now, I just want to remind our guests, and I'm not saying that Guyanese have short attention span, um, but I know Mr. Noharsting has reminded me often that our audience, we tend to lose them when we give very long, extensive responses. I can tell you, I do have a ton of questions when this program was announced from people as far as Canada, Hawaii, Guyana, and so on. I can't get to all of them, but I've selected what I think are the most crucial ones that our audience will be interested in. And I know you gentlemen are big boys. You can handle anything that I throw at you, right? So before we get into our discussion of the race issue, just a couple of icebreakers, right? So my first question um, is to, I guess, Mr. Dev and Dr. Hines, you can pick it up. Um, the recent decision by GCOM to abandon house-to-house registration, um, does this bring us closer to a national election?
Well, unfortunately, the jury is out on that. I don't see that the decision was made so late in the day. And secondly, the terms under which the decision was made, which is that while it had the house registration will stop on Saturday, I don't understand why it could have been done immediately. And what GCOM has done in the meantime is to extend the hours of registration. So in fact, they're going to get some more last clicks to get more individuals registered. Now, if the decision had already been made that there should be ways found to hasten the creation of a list, then this does not help in any way, shape, or form. The second order that was made is that the list must be merged. Now, when you're doing merging of two separate lists into each other, especially when you talk of so many variables that are inputted on these forms, you could have so many variances that I can see a tremendous number of addition to the list. So I don't see how this helps when the PNC had said the list was already bloated. You have to check so many 200,000 people who are not on. Now you're going to have a greater bloatation of the list. And I don't see how that helps that side. The last one would be in terms of the terms and objection. It said there should now be an extended period for terms of objection, objection. So I don't understand what that extended mean. How far is it going to be extended? Because you have now given so many variables that now have to be checked. Such a large extended list that I see that maybe nothing has changed. Maybe we'll still have elections next year.
Dr. Hines?
Yeah, I myself am a little bit puzzled by the decision, but I think what has happened is the GCOM chair is trying to marry the two major conclusions that the Chief Justice came to. On the one hand, she came to the conclusion that the house-to-house registration is legal. And I thought when the chairperson said that that should be merged, she's affirming that part of the decision. But the other part of the decision, which says that you can't take people off the list, I think by holding on to the expired list, she's satisfying that. And in the process, she has given both sides something that they wanted. The government side wanted a house-to-house registration, and the other side wanted claims and objections, right? And so in trying to compromise, I agree with Ravi that you could make the problem more difficult, and instead of early election, we may have later election, because there'll be duplications because you're bringing two lists together. You have to weed those out. I'm hearing that in the claims and objection period, those people who did not get to register with the household registration, there is a mechanism by which they will get onto the list during the claims and objection period. I am interested in what extended claims and objection means. And until that is clarified, I don't think that we can be talking about any projection for election.
Then, David, is also Basil's resort to the court to knock out the whole judgment in terms of you can't take off individuals from the list. So that's another unknown in the equation. So I don't think we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
No, I agree. I agree because in a sense, the fact that that matter is tied up in the court, or that aspect of the CJ's ruling is tied up in the court, it means it's been challenged in the court. In a sense, the decision is an interim decision because it has to, in a sense, wait and hear what the court says. So I agree. I don't see how we can have elections. My own prediction, had the house registration run its course, was that we could have had elections by December, which I thought was reasonable, given the fact that we have had the passage of the no confidence motion a year ago. I thought December was a reasonable cutoff point. I don't know that we can do all that we're supposed to do now with the merging of the list in that period of time.
Well, I'm not so sure we could talk. I don't want to get us tied up in here, David, but I can see when you have a constitutional stipulation that the election should have been held 3 months from December 21st, how we can talk about it a year later for it to be reasonable. So we know all kinds of red herrings were thrown out there, basically to delay elections. And this is where my disappointment in the whole system is that in trying to make political a point in terms of dragging out the elections, I think the PNC has really undermined the basis of our constitution. by not taking the spirit of what the Constitution has been saying, because it was very clear 3 months after a no confidence motion, there should have been elections. And all of these things that were thrown up about the half man and about the house to house registration, there was a procedure, and the chief and the present GCOM is accepting that there was a procedure of claims and objections that can do a credible job of presenting a list. But I think we maybe should move on to the matter on hand.
Well, let me.
But I just want to say that Ravi's observation, I mean, touches one aspect of the problem, which is the legal and constitutional aspect. But there is a broader political aspect, which I think those who champion the position that Rafi is taking tend to underestimate. When you have a difficult society like the Guyanese society, it is not just the letter of the law that comes into the spirit of the law and the politics behind the whole thing. So I think we are where we are because we are a difficult society. If we were a straightforward society, clearly no confidence vote is passed. 3 months later, you go to election. No, not so in Guyana. Guyana is a very complex place. And I think the solution does not lie in strict constitutionalism, nor does it lie in the political aspect of it. I think we have to find, as the CCJ said, some kind of marrying of the two, the political and the constitutional.
We see when your actions become so expedient, David, and that's my worry, that the Constitution has been undermined, and therefore when our people, and we both agree they are divided, and we'll discuss that at great length, when they are so divided, there must be something that holds us together. And in my estimation, that something is our Constitution. That our Constitution has, as Yang Chan ruled, a basic structure. And one of that basic structure is that we are a democratic society. And in a democratic society, it is the people, it is their sovereign. And if their voice cannot be given weight, then where do we go from that? And that is my fear. That if we undermine that, it's like the foundation of our entire Guyanese edifice is going to collapse. And we have always
undermined it, Rafi. I'm not saying that it's undermined now, but I understand why you're saying that. I can think of no time in our post-colonial history when the two ethnic groups or the two major parties have agreed on the Constitution. So the point I'm making, the very Constitution has been conveniently used by both sides. When the PNC was in power, it championed constitutionalism, its constitution that it put in place in 1980. And the PPP didn't recognize that constitution only when it came to power in 1992. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there. We don't even agree on the constitution. So we don't have any overarching mechanism.
But at some point, David, we have to say the emperor has no clothes. And right now, the emperor that is walking around naked is the PNC. And we just can't say it right now. And when the PPP, if they were to demonstrate that they don't have any clothes, we can say so. Because to their credit, while Donald Ramutar did prorogue Parliament, as was constitutionally allowed, he did hold elections and was voted out of office and did accede to that. So I'm not so sure that we can make this kind of false equivalence at this juncture I'm talking about, and we can go back. But Beturam, go ahead.
All right, so here's my next question, and this is going to be a short one. Whatever comes out of this process and whatever GCOM decides, when the election is being held, are both of you confident that this election will be free and fair? Mr. Dev and then Dr. Hines.
No, Beturam. I cannot at this juncture length to delay the elections. There must be something. And we can only look back at their history. And while history is not a total predictor of the future, we can gain clues from that. And what we know of the PNC is that it has had a history of rigging elections, And if one were to put it to the test, they have a graduate degree in rigging of elections. They know more than anybody there. So I am very, very wary of this registration exercise where over 300,000 will be added to the list, and those 300,000 were registered in the absence of the PPP scrutineers, and they will now be put in. And there are ways where I can't even envisage, but I am saying I'm not sanguine that this election is not going to be rigged, and we are not going to have free and fair elections. In a nutshell, that's my fear.
Dr. Hines?
I think it's going to be very difficult to rig this election. The entire world is looking at Guyana. We've always had people who have tried to verify our election, observers coming in and so on. I think this is the most watched election. And in that regard, I think it's going to be very difficult to rig. I think both sides have been trying to get an advantage. The PPP has been trying to use the old list, which, from my estimation, gives it an advantage.
But David, how could it give them an advantage if they lost an election based on that list? I really don't. This is the part that has been bothering me. If the PPP will use the list and the match was drawn in 2011, then the match was lost by them in 2015 with that same OLE. How can now it be exploited by them? Meaning, did they rig themselves out of office?
No, they obviously there have been demographic shifts.
No. But we're talking about the original list. You're saying somehow it be an advantage. Why didn't they use that advantage to remain in office?
Well, they've learned from their mistakes. It's as simple as that, Rafi. They've learned
so they built in something and didn't bother to use it.
No. The PPP attempted to rig the election in 2011 and 2015 with that list. They've tailored the rigging machinery, and I know that the rigging tag is on the PNC, but the PPP demonstratively in 2011, and it not been for Vincent Alexander, would have won that election with a single seat. And in 2015, had Mr. Lowenfield not detected the fake polls, statements of polls, they would have won.
But neither of those two maneuvers you're describing has to do with the nature of the list, David. You're changing the goalposts there.
No,
Let's come back to the nature of the list. Let me grant you that those two maneuvers were made. They don't relate to the nature of the list. And that is why I felt that list could have been cleansed through the claims and the objections period. But let's not go back on that. But I'm saying this is why I feel it would be rigged, because the whole world was watching, David, in 1978. Dr. Rodney talks about that when he spoke about that speech, Power to the People. He spoke about how that the 78 referendum was rigged. The whole world was watching. In 80, the world was watching. In 85, the world was watching. In fact, the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group called the 1980 elections more crooked than barbed wire. But they were here. But the PNC didn't give a damn. So at this juncture, again, I am not sanguine that the PNC. Dr. Rodney described that PNC machinery completely in that speech, People's Power, No Dictator, right before he was assassinated in 1979, that speech. And if you go back to the analysis that he made of the nature of the PNC, you're seeing very many of those characteristics arising out of that. The whole insistence that it can do whatever it wants and it can justify itself to remain in power. Not much has changed, David. I had hopes that things would have changed. I myself was one of those who talked about change in 2011, but the change is not happening, and I'm seeing the same old mark of the old PNC.
Well, Ravi, as a student of history, you would know that the world has changed considerably. The fact that the PNC could have done what it did during the period of the Cold War, because of the dynamics of the Cold War, the PNC could have done that and gotten away with it. The Cold War has changed the dynamics of the world, and it's not the same world as 40 years ago.
David.
No, but
my friend, you've been simply as the Cold War. One interest might have changed in the communism whether Guyana to go communist, but there are other strategic interests that those same powers also have. Right now, we have economic interests, which are just as dominant as ideological interests. So the structural conditions remain intact. And I am not, again, complacent about the PNC giving up free and fair elections.
No, I disagree with you, obviously, on that. I think the world has changed fundamentally. And the scope to rig an election 40 years ago, that scope is not there today. I'm not saying there's not scope for rigging. In fact, I think those two major groups look to get advantage. There's advantage that you're going to get in any election, whether you want to call it rigging or not, given the way in which the society is structured. And I think it's a matter here of preventing large-scale rigging. And I don't think that there is the scope for large-scale rigging.
Well, let me come back to you, David. No, let me finish this point here. So I want to make sure I get you straight, David, because I respected the WPA as a party that had a certain ideology, that had a worldview. So you're saying that because the ideological question is not on the front burner, that the economic question that is now on the agenda for those same powers that looked away and didn't say anything, you're saying the economic interest is not as important or as important to them as the ideological interest was back in the 60s?
No, I'm not saying that. Obviously, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the ideological dynamics had much more of a larger weight on what happened in a country like Guyana than the economic interest.
My. Right. David, a Marxist-Leninist party saying economics take lesser role than ideology.
No. This is not a Marxist-Leninist party speaking. This is me. I am saying that I'm not speaking for my party here.
You're not a Rodneyite. You're not a Rodneyite anymore, David.
I don't think Rodney was dogmatic. I think you all present him as this dogmatic person who in 1978 would have said something, and then he would have looked at the world that has changed 50 years later and said the same thing. I think that's doing a disservice to him. One of the things about Walter Rodney, and I know him very well, personally and from studying, he was a concretist. He looked at the concrete situation and he drew conclusions. And I am disgusted that people constantly stick him in time. This is what he said in 79, and this is what the same thing he will say today. No, that's not the Rodney.
But don't you think, David, that people who care about Rodney, others, and I include myself in that thing, are also disgusted by those who take positions that are totally out of consonance with what he has done, and not in the concrete circumstances, because the man stuck to principles. And those principles are articulated, they're out there. So it is not, I don't think his principles would have changed. I think the concrete circumstances always would change, but not his principles. I don't think so.
Yeah, but I am part of the WPA today, and I don't see any way in which the WPA has digressed from the principles that Walter Rodney adumbrated. In fact, the principles that Walter Rodney put out there were not separate from the principles of the larger WPA. Walter Rodney was not out there on its own. Walter Rodney did not found the WPA, as people like to say. Walter Rodney joined the WPA, and he was the loudest voice, the most articulate voice at the time. But, I mean, you all cannot get this man stuck in time. I mean, Walter Rodney was a dynamic person.
We'll come back to Rodney. I have a question for Deb, but first let me ask Dr. Hines. If the PPP, hypothetically, if the PPP wins this election, would that bring peace in Guyana?
No.
And why?
For the same reason that it won't bring peace if the coalition wins. Because what we have is a divided society along politically, ethno-political lines. And neither of the two ethnic groups would accept the leadership of the other party. And so, therefore, I don't think them winning is a political solution. I support the coalition, not because I think that's the solution to Guyana's problem. I support the coalition because it is a coalition of parties. And so I think the possibility for shifting the focus of government towards genuine inclusivity stands a better chance. Now, they did a horrible job at that in the first storm. So I'm not saying here that they've done a good job, but I think potentially the country stands a better chance of moving towards harmony by a coalition of parties rather than a single party.
So David,
And that's the
how
reason. Yeah.
they said the past is a problem to the future.
Yeah.
If the PNC showed such disrespect to the AFC, which gave it 11% of the vote to put it over, if it showed such disrespect to the WPA, which gave it legitimacy within the African Guyanese community, in a sense, legitimized it that yes, we can sit down together. And if they gave such short shrift to the two groups in the first term, what gives you any hope that they will change in the future?
Well, the hope that I have is that those two parties, the AFC and the WPA, will stand up erect this time around. I didn't think the first time around that they did a good job at standing up erect. Now, the PNC will, as a big party, as a hegemonic party, will operate in a certain way. But I think the other parties, as you correctly said, the WPA gave them legitimacy. The AFC gave them the votes to get them over the line. But I think those parties did not do a very good job at defending themselves against the PPP.
So you think the AFC will develop a backbone in the coming 5 years?
Well, one has to hope that. I'm optimistic. I don't know that. There's nothing I can stand there now and say this will happen. I know, for example, my own party, the WPA, has taken that position that this second time around, if we win, that we are not going to behave in the same way.
David, I'm not just telling you, sorry about that, but it takes billions of years for earthworms to develop into backbones to form in themselves into amphibians.
David, Ravi, you can't be that pessimistic. I mean, you know, you have to be optimistic.
I'm not familiar with the earthworm, so let's come back to. Let me just ask David a question based on what you just said. I'll tell you one of the disappointment I have with the WP. I know you've said things have changed. Obviously, conditions have changed. But my biggest disappointment with the WPA is that I know Rodney. He would be clear in his statement if he says something like, "Well, I'm African, I'm a Caribbean, I'm a Guyanese person," and he understands this whole question about being black, right? We understand that. But Rodney also spent a lot of time trying to create a multi-racial organization. The WPA, and according to Fred Kissoon, the WPA is an African party today. So if the WPA, and again, that's what he said in one of his columns. Yeah. So if the WPA, and you are also very much concerned about, blackness and improving, the conditions of blacks and so on. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But to come back to what you said before, if you represent, that part of the WPA, which one doesn't seem to have that multicultural approach a la Walter Rodney. You seem to be moving more towards, empowering blacks and so on. And then we have and this is the question I posed to Kemraj Ramdatan. If the AFC came in with that 11% representing Indians, and if we're saying that the coalition is a true reflection of all Guyanese, my question is, who speaks for Indians? If you speak for Africans, the PNC is an African-based party. The question is, if the AFC is not speaking on behalf of Indians, the question is who? And why not you, the WPA, which was once a multiracial, party?
The WPA never spoke for Indians. The WPA attracted Indian support in the struggle against an African government. That was the reality of the situation. When it went to the polls in 1985 and 1992, Indians did not vote in numbers for the WPA. There's a difference between Indian support in a struggle against an African government and Indian support at an election in which there is the Indian party there. I just want to go back to a piece, an interview that Rodney did, which Ravi knows very well because Ravi is the person who introduced me to that. It's an interview he did on the forum in which he talked about the two sides strengthening themselves so that they could come together. Rodney was not oblivious to the fact that you had to do work in the African community and you had to do work in the Indian community, and that you those two communities then come together. He did not believe that they will automatically come together. What history has shown us is what Guyana calls meeting and parting. There are moments, you yourself, 1953, there was a meeting. 1955, there was a parting. Under Rodney, there was a meeting. Free and fair elections, there is a parting. That is the nature of the society. You can't be multiracial, a multiracial party, if there is not a multiracial constituency. From the 1992, once those free and fair election came, the multiracial coalition on the ground was broken up. And so it is not that the WPA became an African party, it's that the Indian elements left the WPA. I mean, that is a fact, right, which people do not take into consideration. All right, we find it very difficult.
So my friend, Rupert,
hold on.
When addressing one.
My second part of the question then is obviously, WP is different, right, today. My second part of that question
the country is different today, and all parties are different.
Right.
All parties. It is not just the WPA.
Right.
All parties are different.
What if I might, before you come in, let me say this, because there's contradiction here. You see, the WPA, like I said before, had certain principles that was guided, and I understand the history, but Dr. Rodney, to his credit, he bestrode the WPA like a colossus, and we can't get away from that.
Guyana.
Well, all Guyana also.
Right.
And we should not do the injustice to him. What I want to know is that how can the WPA be part of a government where we know the AFC either has been broken by the PNC or in some way intimidated by them, but is not speaking up, for example, when Sugar closed. I was totally amazed for Kemra Rajatan to actually boast that he was integrally involved in the closure of Sugar. Now, you may rationalize you need to right size it and so on, but it was the way in which it went about no alternative to 7,000 workers. My point is, though, that the old WPA would have spoken out on the principle of justice for the working class. But I did not hear that sound this go around when that injustice was done.
I am not sure that you're correct about that.
Okay.
I'm not sure that you're correct about that. I have spoken out very loudly on that issue. The party elders have spoken out very loudly on that issue. Professor Clive Thomas, who was the chairman of Gaisuko, was not the person who advocated for the closure of the estate. So I don't understand why you're saying that the WPA.
But he didn't say a word, and it's Clive myself I'm looking at.
Yeah.
It's Clive himself I'm looking at. He headed a commission of inquiry. We talked about getting funding for 3 more years to correct what ails the industry, to bring it to a point.
Right.
And after his commission of inquiry's recommendation was thrown out, and arbitrarily and unilaterally a decision was made, Clive didn't utter a word. And that is not in consonant. I see him as a senior leader. He was the last presidential candidate in '92. He's a senior leader of the WPA. He is in government and yet did not say a word. And that is part of my disappointment.
But the WPA spoke out.
Let me ask you a question, Mr. Dev. You have been very vocal as a leader of ROAR. I remember you did, you very campaign, and when the campaign was on, the PPP accused you of trying to split the vote. There was a campaign led by the PPP organized in front of your home during that time when ROAR was a political party. So my question is, how do you see the PPP today? Do you have any alliance with them, or are you connected to the PPP?
No, I'm not in any way, shape, or form connected with the PPP or have any relationship with the PPP. However, as I've said on other occasions, while the PPP is not an Indian party, it is a party of Indians. So in terms of the group in which I work, in terms of the group that I seek to help to empower them, they have given their political allegiance to the PPP. Now, there's another irony that I notice is that I am always amused when the PPP is dubbed a racial Indian party, when the PPP would not touch questions of ethnicity with its 10-foot pole. I mean, they still hark back to Dr. Jagan's dictum, which has now become law, I would suppose, in the party, to insist that the party is a multiracial party and therefore cannot speak out on behalf of Indians, even when they are so much being oppressed. And that is the irony of the PPP. So, no, very clearly, I am still working in the Indian community. I retired from politics in 2006 after Roar went into coalition with GAP, the Indian party. And since then, I've been working in the grassroots among the Indian community, trying to empower at that level. And there is no relationship with the PPP to answer your question.
Well, you were a member of parliament for a number of years. So my question is, what have you done to address the ethnic racial issue in Guyana?
Well, the main reason, and I would say that Roar's raison d'etre, its reason for being, was to put this new problem, the problematic of race, and which we're supposed to be discussing tonight, on the table. And when Roar was only formed in 1999, let's remember that. But way back in 1990, I had put out a paper called For a New Political Culture, in which all of what Roar was later to stand for was encapsulated. And to wit and to cut it down into a bite-sized piece, the main point of For a New Political Culture is that we cannot sweep race, or we prefer to talk about ethnicity. We cannot put or sweep race or ethnicity under the carpet. And until the politicians are willing to confront the special problems that ethnic politics present, we will be forever mired in this Sisyphean dilemma, to try so strenuously agitate, but again to start afresh every 5 years after election. So I think we put race on the question, on the agenda. We put it fairly and squarely, but we put it from a standpoint that it affected both groups. For African Guyanese in 1990, we pointed this out, that if Indians were to vote as a bloc, and they are a majority, then there is no incentive for African Guyanese to respect the vote because they can see themselves excluded perpetually. And we call that the African ethnic security dilemma, that majoritarianism for them was not a good word. Free and fair elections was not a good word when you will be excluded automatically from power. But the Indians also had a structural problem, their ethnic security dilemma, which was even if they won that election free and fair through their numbers, they will not be able to govern because the coercive arms of the state, at that time, the army, the police, the national service, the people's militia, all of that was in the control of the PNC. The bureaucracy was under their control. So even if Indians were to take governance, they cannot rule. As even Jagan had once said, they will be in office but not in power. And when I said this at a conference in Trinidad in 1995, I was a member of the Race Relations Commission under Bishop George. And I predicted in 1995 that there would be violence in Guyana because of the structural exclusion of Africans from government. And I was criticized. Freddie Kisoon, for one, criticized me. But in 1997, all hell broke loose. And we know what that segued into from 1998 to 2008. Violence not only against Indians, but eventually against the state. So I come back to it. What Roar put on the agenda is that we cannot ignore the peculiarities and the idiosyncrasies of ethnic voting.
Well, to you, David, I know you're a part of the coalition, but so my question is, how would you address, how do you propose we address the race slash ethnic problem in Guyana?
But I think we have to come at it from two standpoints. I think we have to come at it from the structural standpoint, and Ravi and I have been hammering that away now for a very long time, that we have to do something about the structure of government itself. We have to have a framework of government that both sides feel a stake in, that both sides feel ownership in. And it's in that context that we were talking about federalism, power sharing, to find a way to ensure that when elections are finished, that neither side feels left out of the process. And I think that is that still is on the table. And you know, in your introduction, I think you did a disservice to Mr. Guyana because his proposal in 1961 was for joint premiership between Dr. Jagan and Mr. Burnham. And partition was put in as a last resort. So the proposal was not partition, the proposal was joint premiership. And I think that set the stage for the later discourses that we've been having on power sharing, which is now called shared governance. I think that still has to be a primary focus going forward. But we, of course, know that the nature of ethnicity itself plays against that, because whenever the party gets into power, it then pushes that on the back burner. The PPP did it. Dr. Jagan said in 1990 that winner take all politics must go. Yet he was 1992. Between 1992 and 1997, he did absolutely nothing. This coalition had it on its platform, and it was, I have to tell you, I know in 2011, it was the most popular platform plank. Every time they talked about the government of national unity, people went crazy, because I think, as Ravi Dev said, African Guyanese, being a minority ethnic group, recognize that in order for it to have a stake in power, in order for them, it has to be some form of power sharing. Yet when our government, this government, got into power, it pushed that on the back burner. Constitutional reform hardly got off the ground. So we're seeing that parties, when they're in opposition, they champion this structural change in governance, but when they get into power. So what we have there is the tension between the actuality of power and this ideal of a government of national unity, and we've not been able to bring the two of them together. But I think, yeah.
Now, you've written a book on power sharing.
Yeah.
How do we, since you're now also part of the coalition, what are some specific things that we, either structural or otherwise, that we could actually do to move in that direction? Because I mean, the country can't continue to exist like this, where the two major races are, divided the way it is.
Well, I think we have to agree on constitutional reform, because we're not going to get those structural changes outside of constitutional reform. That we can't agree on constitutional reform. I mean, the PPP has no interest in a reform that is going to lessen its chances of getting back into power. And the other side is not interested in constitutional reform to get it out of power. And so I think that the parties outside of the political arena have to come to some kind of consensus on constitutional reform to deal with the race thing. I go back to the Rodneyite position, which I think is organizing among people. I mean, one of the reasons for the success of Walter, the Rodney era, because that process was started by Moses Bagwan and Guyana in the Race Relations Commission, which preceded Rodney coming. I think we have to go back on the ground and begin to work there. Because I think ultimately that's where the solution.
We see, David, the problem with that is that in Guyana, and it's probably most third world societies, that the government it looms so large over the power structure that on the ground, where I've been working since 2006, you really can't make an impact, because the pressures that are coming down so heavy on the populace. Like right now, I can tell you that the pressures have come so hard on the Indian population. Just take sugar alone. What has happened in Kanji, when the entire Kanji is now totally without any source of employment. When you talk of Skeldon completely gone, Wales, and these are things that I believe within the coalition, not enough pressure was put on the government. Take, for example, I'll give you a personal example of how uncaring the PNC is, yet without any. When Wales closed down, now, David, this is not just about Indians. Wales has the largest percentage of African sugar workers out of all the sugar plantations, because I helped to organize the sugar union, as you know, and we know the facts on the ground. 40% are African descent. But just as importantly, Wales has the largest number of cane farmers in Guyana at Wales. Very efficient cane farmers. Yet when Wales was closed down, no one from the WPA stood up and stood with those people. Everybody fell in line, because here was a chance that that you could speak out against this abruptly. I personally got in touch with a sugar manufacturer in India that they were willing to purchase Wales almost immediately. I took Nigel, my old friend Nigel, and and Dr. Surendra, and we went to meet the Minister of Business and the Minister of Agriculture to put this proposal on the table, and the thing was rejected outright. They will look at it later. This is the first time I'm revealing this. But what I'm saying is that within the government, there was no feeling for the ethnic implications of their action, both in closing the entire sugar industry, those 4 estates, and Wales in particular. So it basically, and this is where I feel that I put back the pressure on WPA, because AFC has now said they agree totally. But where was the WPA when this was happening?
No, well, Ravi, I think that you are making too much of the fact that the WPA was not in Wales, organizing and speaking out on the Wales thing. I think you put the problem there is that there is this tension between the political imperatives and what needs to be done in terms of solving the race problem. I thought you were going to say that the African people at Wales Estate did not pressure their government. I thought that's what you were going to say.
No. You see, I'm saying historically, my father was a cane cutter.
Yeah.
You cannot expect ordinary people at that level to articulate their grievances in such a manner. I'm saying the WPA is in this government, and the WPA has a history of an enlightened position on these issues. So to come back to what I say, the betrayal of Walter Rodney, is that there was no WPA on the ground in Wales grounding with those individuals there.
Yeah, but you can't expect... It's not about whether there was WP on the ground. I mean, all progressive people should have been on the ground.
But you see what happened, and I'll tell you this: when those who went to Wales was all Indians, was PPP, so then the thing became racialized. My hope is if the WPA had gone out there on a principled position, and even if they had gone there just for the African component, I would have said, you know what, we are in solidarity. Just like when Walter brokered that thing between the bauxite workers and sugar workers back in 76, 77. And I thought this could have been a repetition of that, but it was not to be. But as you said, times have changed, and que sera, sera, maybe.
And the WPA is in government, which is a big change. If you're in government, you have to balance your responsibility to government and your responsibility to your traditional principles. And if you notice, the WPA has had a dual approach since being in government. On the one hand, it has been quote unquote loyal to the government, but on the other hand, you have people like myself who have stood up against the government. I don't think that you are figuring that enough. I stood up against this government as a WPA person. Doesn't that count for something, Ravi?
It does, but I'm saying as a group, the WPA, I felt as WPA for the memory of that man who is honored across this world. that they would have stood up. But as I
Well,
said,
I stood up for him.
And you
But what I'm saying is that the WP had a dual approach. I mean, you're in government, you have to be loyal to the collective, but you also, given the principle, given your own history, you've got to take certain stand. And I and some others have taken a very strong stand. I mean, the stand that I took caused the government to punish me. And I saw this thing that the WPA has abandoned all its principle. I feel somewhere or the other, well then, I am not part of the WPA, so forget about Hines, right? He ends
Yeah,
in the
but
WPA.
David, the
Walter's
one that I
essential
took,
point was that there is no one-man thing, David.
yeah,
WPA, as you yourself said earlier, it's not a one-man thing. I think it's an entity that
all right.
stood for certain things.
We have to move on, right? But the one
Yeah, go
thing
ahead.
in my mind here, David, is the one thing that I have a hard time accepting is the fact that you're now working with the government that assassinated Walter Rodney, right? So that just sticks in my head. And I know, and I hear what you're saying. Times have changed. Let me move on.
Beto, we all are talking about the government of national unity. We all have to work with that government that assassinated not just Rodney, but other people. So this nonsense about working with your assassins, the Palestinians and Israelis will have to work with each other. You have to work if you're in a country and you're talking about unity. You're going to leave out the PNC and say, well, they assassinate Rodney, so I'm not working with them. I think you can't have it both ways. Come on. I mean, the PPP has to work with the PNC who assassinated people from the PPP. And the PNC has to work with the PPP who assassinated their supporters. Assassination is not just Rodney and it's not just one party.
All right, so we'll leave it at. Let's move on. So I want to remind our audience, this program is coming to you live from Globespan. You can obviously, if you're watching us on two internet platforms, YouTube and Facebook. You are welcome to send in your questions, or you can make a phone call if you have a question to our audience. So let's come back to Mr. Dev. In terms of talking about real practical solutions, we know shared government is a concept, right? And we're trying to flesh this out. Mr. Dev, you had once proposed this concept of federalism, and if I recall correctly, the backlash was Mr. Dev is a racist. He's trying to split the country. How do you define that? So the audience can understand. Do you still share the same views, or how would that work?
Just to put that into context, federalism was one part of a menu of measures that Voha put up with. And because when we saw, and even now, all interventions within plural society like ours, they can take two forms. One would be distributive policies, and one would be structural ones. And I want to not get away, I'll come back to your question on federalism, but we talk about distributive policy because the man on the ground, the masses of people of Guyanese want to know what are they getting of the national patrimony. That is what will matter to them near term. And so, for example, at that point, we said that for African Guyanese, they see themselves excluded from the economic spoils. And in fact, part of their fear of Indians winning is that if Indians take political power and couple it with their economic aggressiveness, then what is left for them? So one of the distributive policies, we said that in the African Guyanese community, there must be affirmative action for African Guyanese to enter entrepreneurship, to enter businesses, and to be helped in that direction. Because, and I still believe that until there's some equity in, I'm not a Marxist to talk about economism, that determines everything, but no, but it is important. Man may not live by bread alone, but he'll surely starve if he doesn't get bread. So the point is, we suggested methods to address the African, one of his dilemmas in not being economically secure, but through distributive measures. For the Indians, we suggested that the forces should represent the proportion of the population of Guyana. Because that is, we see that the disciplined forces in every country are not just neutral observers; they are part and parcel of the ethnic problem. So if you go to England, the police force had to take in more blacks. If you go to any city in America, including Tucson, Arizona, where David is, they had to take in more blacks because you need representation for people's security to feel it's more secure. Hasn't done much for blacks in America, but that's a different story we can come back to. So I want to say we did not just put federalism on the books. It was a whole host of things. Federalism addressed one central issue that for all the history of Guyana, we only knew one form of governance, which is a concentrated authoritarian government from top down, where the British governor ruled us and we had to jump and ask how high when he said jump. Now, because we inherited that from Britain, we think that is all there is to government. If we had been ruled by Holland, Holland, from their history, has a different viewpoint of sharing, of including everyone. They call it pillarization because they had Catholics, they had, you have Belgium with Flemish and the Dutch. You have Switzerland with German, French, and German, French, and Italians in Switzerland. So you have other experiences where people were conditioned to come together. So federalism in each of these countries is also a measure to distribute power. You don't have one central power having all power, because when the power is concentrated in one center, then the struggle to capture that power center becomes very intense. But when it is distributed, it lessens that. So federalism was never about dividing Guyana. It was to have a whole matrix of power centers where everybody, in fact, one of my most stringent criticism of Mr. Burnham and Mr. Ellis and myself agreed on this point, that the worst thing Mr. Burnham did was to destroy the village government, the village structure, the village councils, which African Guyanese had founded in Guyana. So we didn't just say federalism. We talk of deep devolution. Federalism is one end of that spectrum, but can go all the way to what Mr. Hoyt and Mr. Burnham came out with his 10 region business, which, as you know, does amount to. The one difference that federalism does, it doesn't leave the powers of the subunit to chance. It makes it into law that particular unit has what is called a competency, and that competency is enshrined in the Constitution. So if we can do that in present to enshrine the powers of the lower parts of government lower down, then you don't even have to call it federalism. It's deep devolution of power. The main thing is that the fellows on top must not be able to pluck their hand in and then put in a town clerk, and the town clerk has to do whatever he wants. It has to be different. So federalism, in essence, is defining powers lower down, but giving them the competency to move and develop themselves.
If I may, Beto, if I may come back to what I'd started to talk about, educating people on both sides of the ethnic divide, which I think is the work that needs to be done not by government, but by these ethnic groups, the ACDAs and the Indian Arrival Committee groups and so on. I think those groups have to do some serious education among the people, because I detect that there are two instincts. There is the power instinct among both ethnic groups where they struggle for political power. But then below that, there's an instinct of wanting to live together and ethnic tolerance. And I think Rodney was able to exploit that partly because the WPA did a lot of political education. And political education becomes important because it then creates the condition for people then to accept certain policy proposals. And I agree with Ravi that there has to be affirmative action on both sides. Economic affirmative action for African Guyanese and affirmative action for Indian Guyanese in the areas of the coercive forces and so forth. But you have to have a condition in the country where both sides will accept those changes. And I think that is the big problem we have. Policy changes have to be grounded in an atmosphere of ethnic tolerance and ethnic trust, if I may use that term. because the PPP like to talk about trust at the top. I think the trust has to be at the bottom. And I think that then makes it easy for policy. So the policy of affirmative action, I completely agree with that. I think unless we deal with the question of the overall economic condition of African Guyanese, we are not going to go anywhere with ethnic unity. Even poor Africans and poor Indians, they experience and they articulate that poverty differently. African poverty is articulated within the context of the long history of slavery and so forth. And Indians articulate their poverty different. And so the argument that I'm making here is that the African condition, given the fact that it is grounded historically in slavery, has to be approached differently. I hear people say, well, when you make this argument, you're saying that Indians are not poor. Nobody can be foolish to say that Indians are not poor. The majority of Indians are poor. But we're saying African poverty has a deeper root because it's rooted in slavery and that it calls for a particular policy attention. And so I want to throw that out there as a practical thing. But you are only going to get that if there is a consensus at the bottom, meaning people understand the African condition. The average Indian think that black people really should get no affirmative action. They're lazy. They don't want to work. All right?
Well, you see, David.
Hold on. That is understandable, given the fact that we are not doing enough education on the ground. And the African people have some biased position against Indians, and we have to do more of that. So affirmative action. I think Ravi and I have agreed that we have to put in place, and this should be easy. And the coalition has it in its manifesto, thanks to the WPA. It has not been put into practice. And that is your question of ethnic impact statements. That when you're doing big policy, like you are looking at sugar, you want to right size sugar, you need to do an ethnic impact statement. How is this going to affect the Indian population? Because that's where they work. If you're doing things like wages for public service, ethnic impact statements. So we need those things. And I want to throw that out here tonight as another way of dealing practically with the problems. And I think that can be done without much fuss.
We see, David, coming back to the notion of WPA being working from within to change the system.
Yeah.
But this is where the WPA then has to speak up. You can't have it both ways. You'll be seen as, riding with the hounds and running with the hares. Yeah. And that is what I'm telling you right now, from the standpoint of me being within the Indian community. You can't have it both ways. There has to be a stand taken, because that whole element of trust cannot occur in a vacuum. It must be accompanied through actions. And the action on sugar was not an easy one to develop trust. Trust me on that. Now, to come back to what was the other question you had there, Beto?
Go ahead. David was talking about affirmative action and the ethnic impact statement, but I was going to follow up with something. Yeah. And my question was to David, if we're going that route, and that seems to be a good way to address issues, especially in multicultural society. I mean, I haven't heard much, and I'm sure I don't know everything you've said, but I haven't heard much coming from you. When we talk about changing the structure of society, I haven't heard much about changing the structure of the disciplined forces and the army and the police, and so on, or try to make those institutions more multi-ethnic.
Yeah. Well, that was always a bone of contention between Ravi and I. Ravi paid a lot of attention to including the Indians in the armed forces. And I would always say to Ravi, well, I'm going to go for that when you talk about including Africans in the economic sector. And I think we've come to that understanding tonight.
No, but David, let me throw this to you tonight.
Yeah.
In 2004, there was a Discipline Force Commission report. Right. And Roar would like to put itself up that we helped to create that Discipline Force Commission to examine the composition of the discipline forces, among others. It was a constitutional stipulation which was given life. And I must say that the PNC did agree to that commission. I must say Mr. Corbyn did agree to that commission. And for whatever reason, it got held up until 2010 in the parliament. But that commission report has been passed and approved by parliament. Yeah. And so this government, of which Mr. David Granger was a member of that commission, it talked about affirmative action to bring in more Indians into the force. But not a squeak has happened. Last week, to my delight, one of the commanders in the police force talked about going to the Tushaus to inform them to bring in more Amerindians into the force, indigenous people into the force. Great. But how about doing the same in the Indian communities? And I think that's what Beto is talking about. Yeah. We got to show some kind of equality in our approaches, or else you create a backlash in the Indian community and they cannot be blamed. And I'm telling you, the backlash is very, very strong. Right now, you don't need anybody to convince the Indian people not to vote for APU. They're doing a real good job about it.
Yeah. Well, yes, and I agree there has to be equality, but there also has to be balance. And I think that if government says, look, we are going to take these two approaches. We're going to have affirmative action for the armed forces, and then we're going to have affirmative action for blacks getting into the commercial sector. I think if we do the balancing, the country, the people on the ground will have much more of a stomach for it. But if you do one, if you have affirmative action, let's say this government get into the business of affirmative action for Africans, with no affirmative action for Indians, that's trouble. So
but then there is trouble then, David. There is trouble then, because I'll tell you, there's a $2.8 billion grant loan component that was put together by this government that is developing agricultural land behind Ithaca, behind Oka, behind Buxton, behind BV4 core Afro-Guyanese community. We're talking of $2.8 billion of equipment has been built, will be left to the co-ops there. Co-ops are being founded. Markets are being sourced for their funds. And when you have, 7,000 sugar workers with idle land, some of that could have been done for those people also. Yeah. So there has been a tremendous amount of affirmative action for Afro-Guyanese, pushed by organizations such as, which you started, Coffee 250, held several forums, which Mr. David Granger went there and listened and took notice. So there has been, but there has been nothing done for the other side. Now, I hope you will say, well, what was the AFC doing? But I don't know if you will be so indiscreet. But
I can't speak for the AFC, but you have to be a little bit fair, Ravi, that mistakes were made in sugar. Some of it is now becoming clear. But the fact that the government did not close down sugar altogether should be taken into consideration. I mean, when the government came in, it continued a massive subsidy of sugar. So, I mean, yes, David, it has not been a perfect approach.
You can't do this. Just here. Okay.
All right.
All of this commission of inquiry, the Thomas inquiry, said support sugar for 3 years. It'll be 3 years, 24 billion more. This same government borrowed 30 billion in a bond that has to be repaid in 5 years. Every year they're paying $1.5 billion. They paid it last year, they'll have to pay it this year, or maybe has paid it already. $30 billion would have recapitalized the industry. Nothing has been done with that 30 billion. It's sitting in the bank and you're paying interest on it. So it's like, to me, I'll tell you something, being in the Indian community, living in Ifat, I've gone back, as you know, living in the house that my father built when he came out of the Logis. All you can see is that this government is out to destroy, and I use the word very advisedly, to destroy the Indian people. And my conclusion is doing so because it wishes to destroy the People's Progressive Party's base, because that's part of its base. That's the only reason they can be so oblivious to what they're doing to that community. How can you borrow 30 billion when that could have saved the industry two times over, and then say, well, you're lucky we only closed four. That's like cutting out the man's two legs and say, well, I left you with your arms, you know. What can the guy do with his two arms when he can't move?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit strong language there, Ravi. I don't think they're out to destroy Indian
I'm
people.
saying that is how it appears. And
Right.
I'll
Yeah.
say
Yeah.
this. But
Yeah.
when men define their situation as real, it
Uh,
is real in their consequences.
mm,
And that is what I'm saying. That the perception, let us call it perception, that is being created, these people have to act on their perception. That's a law of sociology, the Thomas's theorem. When men define their circumstances as real, they will they will follow through on the consequences.
Yeah,
You
but
know,
you'll be surprised, Ravi, to know that there is also perception in large sections of the African Guyanese community that this government has done nothing for them. So perception can become reality, but we have to be very careful how we advance perception as truth. I just want to say that
yeah, but we
because
have to have. But if you're going to go forward, David, we have to have certain markers. For example, I was in Guyana. Roar was in its formative stage. We were pre-Roar. We were the Jaguar Committee. And when 1992 occurred, there was a household income and expenditure survey, which actually measured the level of poverty in 1992 when the PNC debated office. In that one, the overall percentage of poverty, moderate poverty was 43% for all Guyana. But it was most severe for African Guyanese. African Guyanese were 44.5%. Interestingly enough, Indo-Guyanese in 1992 was only 35% or something like
35,
that.
yeah.
It was less than African Guyanese. Yet at the 1992 elections, even though African Guyanese subjectively suffered more under the PNC, they yet gave the PNC in 1992 their 42%, and WPA got 2%. The point I am making.
The Indians didn't give WPA any either, right?
That's right. That's right.
The
That's right.
multiracial WPA.
It was gone. It was gone. And in fact, when what was his name? Rupert Rupnarayan was removed as the presidential candidate, and Clive Thomas put there, even though Rupert was supposed to have been there, that was not taken well when it was pointed out to the WPA. But come back to the point. I'm saying even at this stage, the WPA has a role to try to change perception by putting out these facts and figures. For example, in 2006, where our poverty figures, they've still gone down. So Clive Thomas wrote a piece in 2014 talking about that, yes, both absolute poverty, relative poverty, the amount of inequality through the Gini coefficient, all of that has gone down. And all of that was within the PPP regime. I once talked about Mr. Guyana, to his credit, personally, we were discussing something, and he said during the PNC years, they did nothing for Buxton. And in the PPP early years, I forget if it's Middle Dam they built or
Build schools.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, the schools he pointed out, yeah.
Is that this kind of education of the people has to be fair as to what are they doing. And I'm still waiting to be shown what exactly has this government been doing for Indo-Guyanese, so we can go and shout it to the mountains.
But I do appreciate the fact that you're saying the WPA has a role to play, and we recognize that, and it's one of the reasons that the WPA right now is in the communities, the African Guyanese communities, doing some political education. And what we're finding out as we are going into those communities is that the African Guyanese community is not as monolithic as it appears to be. Now, overall, in terms of its ethnic response to power, yes, that has not changed. But having said that, African Guyanese are asking questions of this African Guyanese-led government. And what we are finding is that a section of that community is in sync with our critique of the government and our position in terms of what the government needs to do going forward. And sometimes if a political party does not go into the community, it does not understand in a serious way how much work it needs to do. I mean, for years, people have been saying the WPA is dead and so on. And perhaps at a certain level, we came to accept that until we went into the communities and then found out that there were people in the communities who are in sync with the WPA position. And so therefore, I think the challenge for the WPA, as it would be for the AFC and other third parties, is how do you function in a government with one of these big parties, yet do the kind of work that third parties which come out of movements need to do. And I dare say the WPA has to find that
Well,
balance.
I'll give you some gratuitous advice, David.
Thank you very much.
There's something in politics called in coalitions called the disequilibrium in size. And I sat 5 years with the PNC in the opposition. You know that.
Yes.
I sat side by side with them 5 years. Myself, Shirley, and Sheila sat down. They were the three musketeers with the PNC.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something. Once you're within there ain't much you can do. And the bit of gratuitous advice it gives you, one can only speak to power when one can then look up to power from the outside.
But one has to be in power in order to deal with some practical things for one constituency. That's a dilemma.
Well, let me ask. I know we're coming close to the end of our program, and I wish we can continue. So, David, this question is to you. In a volatile situation like ours, and I don't believe that Guyanese hold these animosities after the election. It's just that elections times make us all crazy. But rhetoric is also important. We know about the rhetoric from Mr. Jagdeo at Babu John, the statement made by, which is caught on tape by Minister Vola Lawrence. But you had made a comment about, flushing PPP molds out of the civil service. And can you clarify what that means? Because this was taken to mean that David Hines is just concerned about, removing PPP supporters in the civil service. And I think this was a discussion about whistleblowers and trying to address or expose corruption. Can you clarify that for us?
This is what I said. And you know what is interesting about that is that the majority of those moles are African Guyanese. Right? It wasn't an attack on Indian Guyanese. They're a set of African Guyanese who were cultivated by the PPP, and they're left there in the public service. All right? This government came to power, and perhaps in terms of its ethnic reflexes, figured that, well, these people are now going to turn over their loyalty to them. They didn't. And,
but that sounds like a witch hunt. I mean, how do you know who's a whistleblower and who's a mole?
We live in a small society, Beto. These things are known, and these people have been undermining the government in ways that are really outlandish. I mean, Mr. Jagdeo could know people's personal story, and he gets it from these people. And so when I talk about flushing out PPP molds, there wasn't an ethnic thing about it. I understand that will be seen in ethnic terms, but it was really a lot of these people are African Guyanese.
But David, you really missed the point.
Yeah.
And the point again, I come back to undermining the institutions that hold us together as a state.
Yeah.
Now, for you to say you must flush out moles, that's a McCarthyite kind of language, where, and you use the word witch hunting. And that is why we saw Ms. Sarabo Halley fire, I don't know how many people arbitrarily and unilaterally, which had to be reinstated. I would probably suppose she thought they were moles, and that's why she fired them. But you see, the civil service has a system of procedural aspect to it. And that is why when Weber talks about bureaucratic efficiency, and we put in all of those rules, because the public service is supposed to be what we call the universal class. And we cannot just try to have them be subservient to the government of the day. We must now finally professionalize the public service and all state to be loyal to the state. And that is why our constitution says the cabinet can resign, but the government continues. You know why? Because the country that gave us that clause, England, those public servants can pretty much run the government, as we saw from that, that show, Yes Minister. The minister pretty much signs paper. And that is why my problem with what is going on here, it makes us look like what V.S. Naipaul called an uncultivated
Yeah, yeah,
society,
yeah.
mimic men. That we just brought these institutions here and we brought the form of the institution, but the function of the institution, the substance of the institution, we have lost the whole point. So for you to say, and this is what I again, that surprised me also. That surprised me that when we're going to say we're going to flush out moles, well, we have to talk about why are those people moles? Did they tell a lie? Did they create a lie? Because for public servants, you have a duty not to follow, because America has a Whistleblowers Act,
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
cannot prosecute an individual for passing on information which went against the grain of what the institution is supposed to do. They are
mhm,
protected here.
yeah.
And in Guyana, we have to rise to that. So we can't just say, I carry news and we're going to get rid of it. David, I'm coming back to this whole point that I believe that the PNC still has those habits coming out of it because so many of its ruling class, Mr. Granger goes back to that days. Mr. Granger was Mr. Burnham's chief promulgator of his ideology of paramountcy in the army. You know that while McWilfred was for the public service. And he is totally imbued with that whole culture of paramountcy of the party. And he has put key people like the Russian commissars in every department, not for just to place them and to give them a job. I believe it is more insidious than that. So I think this is where once you're within, you'll be caught up with that because the mentality of those who run armies is not a democratic instinct. They are trained to command and you obey. And I'm saying there's a great danger being done to Guyana right now for
Well, let me
people
give
like yourself to give that kind of credence to such a group.
yeah, let me give David a chance to respond, and then we're going to go into closing statements.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, Ravi, I think you omit that in the 23 years of the PPP, they caught up with the PNC in terms of paramountcy of the party. A lot of the bad habits and a lot of the things that we in the old days in our critique of governance placed at the feet of the PNC, they are now at the feet of the PPP. And I think that that is a dynamic that somebody like yourself has have to come to grips with the fact that the PPP has deteriorated to the same point as the PNC that we critique. And I think it is at that level that we have to change our analysis of the situation in Guyana. I mean, sometimes I hear you guys say it's false equivalency. But I don't think it is. I mean, the kind of ethnic domination that was institutionalized by the PPP brought it up to speed with the PNC. No, my whistleblowing and flush them out. The objective was the depoliticization of the public service because that thing is a consequence of the politicization of the public service. And that politicization didn't start with this government. It went way back to the 1960s and 1970s. It was started by Forbes Burnham and Errol Barrow, English-speaking Caribbean. And it has come to this, where you don't have a public service. What you have are these partisan spies operating and carrying on as if they're public servants. They are not public
Well,
servants,
yeah,
and so therefore,
I'm getting
when
a
I
cue from the
okay,
producer.
all right,
If
all
do you
right.
want to finish up your sentence?
No, I'm saying, so when I talk about flushing them out, I'm not talking about flushing out public servants. I'm talking about flushing out political spies, and I make a distinction between the two in the statement that I made.
All right, let me just say, this was a learning experience for me. I think both of you are, very educated individuals. You have your pulse on the politics of the nation. I wish both of you can actually hold hands and go out there and campaign and try to fix the ethnic racial problem in Guyana. But I think this discussion has to continue. It is important that we are honest and we're more expressive in the way we share these views in terms of searching for a solution for Guyana. I want to remind our audience again that this program was brought to you by Globespan, by Nohar Singh, Devin and his team operating out of New York. So we're now going to go to closing statements. So I just flipped the coin. So David, if you can keep it in less than a minute. Closing.
I'm going to try to. A couple of years ago, Ravi Dev and I did a series of programs on Channel 28. And the late Andai, who I always kept in touch with, said, please continue doing it. And I said, why? She said there were some people working at her place. And they commented on the fact that a black man and an Indian man could talk about race and not quarrel with each other, not fight each other down, and could be respectful to each other. And she felt that that was something that could go a long way towards toning down the ethnic pressure. The series was discontinued, but I have come around to agree with Andai, and I think part of what we're doing here tonight, when I look at these programs, I see some of the nasty comments, which sometimes are not reflective of the quality of the discourse. Ravi and I have had disagreements, and we have expressed some of those disagreements here. But there are points of agreement, and I think the more we have these conversations on the television, on the air, perhaps in the communities, I think it can go a long way. At the end of the day, Guyana is going to go no way with one race in power. Guyana is going to go no place, and we have oil coming. And the coming of oil could exacerbate this ethnic problem. So we are at a critical juncture. We are preparing for an election. Election is hardly the place to deal with ethnic harmony. But I think as soon as that election is finished, we've got to get down to the business outside of government, because government is not the place. Government is not the institution to promote harmony. They can come up with policies, but those policies, I insist, have to come from the ground, where Indian and African leaders come together and speak individually to the communities and together to all of the communities, the ethnic communities.
So Dev?
Well, let me just say that Andai could have said that, David, because he knew both of us loved her. And from wherever she is right now, I think she would be looking down on us, and I hope she is pleased by our continued discourse. As the audience might not know, she passed away not too long ago. Now, I believe, I would like to say to our audience that I believe that we have reached what is called an inflection point in Guyana's history with oil, with the coming of oil. Our politics, to a great extent, was a zero-sum game, because we were so much in dire poverty, especially after '92, after what Mr. Burnham did to that nation, that we are so poverty-stricken that if we gave one something, it was taken from the other one, or at least that is how it's seen. I think finally, we who want this country to go forward will have to take a stand as to how this oil money, this oil revenues will be used. Already I see that while it was supposed to go into the stabilization fund, called the National Resource Fund, or call it what you may, they're already talking of putting it to balance the budget. That's not the way to go. That fund should go with a strategic sense to develop our country, where there will be equitable development. It can't be only agriculture, because we know that my favor Indians who have more. It must encompass all people. The Amerindians must also be encompassed in that development. So I think we have reached that inflection point, and it is more urgent that we do so. Now, the thing is that, David, where I disagree with you is that, having worked on the ground for the last 10 years or more at the grassroots, I think it'll be very difficult to achieve anything outside of the ambit of these political forces. I do agree with you, though, that we in society can help to create the changes, because it is moral and cultural consciousness that will, the change in moral and cultural consciousness that precedes all political change. But we can do that. But I'm saying again, and I put the burden on you, because I know you can take the burden. The WPA in this government has to play a stronger role. And if anybody equivalent to you is in the PPP, they will have to play a stronger role because they'll have to say it as it is. Because both parties want to say they are multiracial, but they don't want to deal with the real problems of the country ethnically. I'm talking that specifically. I would like to thank Globespan for having me on. And David, I came out of retirement for this program.
I realize that.
And Beto had to move mountains. So, but thank you anyway, Beto. I've enjoyed the hour with you.
So have I, and hopefully we can include the Amerindians into this discussion in the
Right,
future. So, gentlemen, it was a real pleasure for me listening to both of you, and I hope we can continue with this. So, on behalf of Globespan, I'd like to say thanks again, and good night, and God bless Guyana.
God bless.
Thank you.